fabulous guest in the studio with me on this Sunday morning as well. His name's Paul Bartlett, and he's the garden manager at Stone Lane Gardens. Paul, tell us first of all about Stone Lane Gardens.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks for having me today.
Well, it's lovely to see you.
So Stone Lane Gardens is quite a hidden gem in Devon, really. Very few people have been there. We'd like a lot more to come. It was started back in the 70s by husband and wife team Kenneth and June Ashburner. And Kenneth started developing. We had a love of trees, particularly birch and alder trees, which he's a renowned world expert on. And he had the need to plant out the trees he was collecting on trips abroad. He'd also started to develop a water garden in the area opposite the house, and they gradually expanded that area, landscaped the area. There were just bare fields which they landscaped. June put in sculpture and started a sculpture exhibition every year. And it grew and grew, and it's a lovely 5-acre woodland and water garden now, very naturalistic. Really
it's a garden adventure, really, isn't it? That's what I think of it. Because Chagford, that's where it is, and it's beautiful bit of countryside there, and the garden itself sort of blends in with the countryside.
It does, yeah. Well, Kenneth had this. He was ahead of his time in the world of sort of garden design for naturalistic planting. Back in the 70s when he started doing it, people weren't doing that very much. His idea was to plant copses of trees, not just a single one. And also the underplanting underneath was not too varied. So like most temperate wild woodlands, you'd get just the same sort of species of underplanting underneath throughout the sort of woodland. You wouldn't get a massive variety you get in tropical areas. So he was replicating that in creating what is obviously a contrived garden, but done in a very naturalistic style.
So he was one of the pioneers, really, of the brave style that we gardeners would recognise. It's always that advice: buy more than one. If you want your garden to look like something, repeat at least a few things.
Of course,
to give it a theme.
Well, plants, I think generally, with the odd exception, plants look great when they're en masse, and that's the way, in nature, that's how they normally develop in most cases.
So what led you to the edge of the moors then?
The edge of the moors. Well, I was had many jobs in my life, but lately I'd been a self-employed gardener working nearby in lots of different garden environments. Did a lot of pond work, did a lot of work with trees. And I went to see the garden once. I was a typical Chagford resident. I'd lived nearby for years without going there, and
it's
once
classic.
was sent along and loved the place. Got chatting with Kenneth and June, who are both very friendly people, so bless them, they were always willing to talk to anyone, and started working for Kenneth that way as a self-employed, and then got more and more involved with the garden, and as Kenneth and June got older, they needed more help in the garden, so I became full-time there.
I just love this. It's time and time again we hear of gardeners getting a post in a garden up the road from them, and it's so Devon, isn't it? But you've never been. If it's on the other side of the valley, why take a chance?
That's right. You'd rather travel miles, use up loads of fuel, rather than
go up the road
somewhere up the road.
You're joking. But so this is a hidden gem, and more people need to come to this garden because it's it's a unique place, isn't it? It has a sense of place, doesn't it?
It does. It's a very magical garden. It's always very peaceful down there, and under the trees, the environment is so different from even on a bad day outside. It's quite sheltered under the trees. It's also sheltered in hot weather. God forbid we should have any this year. But it's a lovely place to be. It's a very spiritual place in some ways as well. Very unlike most West Country gardens, which are lovely gardens, but they do tend to follow a bit of a theme, especially the ones on the coast, and it's a very different style of garden.
It's what makes it quite interesting is this journey element, or return to that, and that's helped often by the sculpture that leads you round. That's the thing I've always known about the garden. How did that start? How did the association with the arts come in?
June obviously recognised, next year we're coming up for our 25th anniversary of the Mythic Garden Sculpture Exhibition, which is what we hold in the garden. And when June started putting the sculpture in and had this idea of a sculpture garden, she had a lot of artist friends. She was an artist herself and knew a lot of people in the area who were very good artists. And so she just had this great idea, and it was a very clever idea to realise that the garden, the growing as it was then, of course the trees were very young at that point, But she could already recognise that this sort of woodland garden would make a perfect place for a gallery, an outdoor gallery for sculpture.
Yeah.
And of course, now that the trees and the underplanting has developed over the years, you can hide the sculptures away in different parts of the garden. And people come across them. It's a kind of magical sort of, especially young children particularly, they just love the fact that you can sort of come around a corner and there's a sculpture that they hadn't seen, and it's sort of exploring and discovering the sculpture. And the trees are to my mind, the trees are the real sculptures, the real art.
That's what I wanted to come to, because it was a new thought when it was created, of having art with a living frame, if you like. And you've got 2 national collections, am I right? Is it 2 or 3?
Have. Yeah, no, we've got 2 national collections of birch, betula, and alder, ulmus. And we have scientific status for the National Collection of Birch as well.
What does that mean?
We've done a lot of research. Kenneth, all over his lifetime was studying the birch, and he became known as one of the leading experts on birch. And eventually, he was writing a book when he died. Sadly, it was almost finished, and Hugh McAllister, his co-author, finished that. And so now the Betula monograph is this great reference work, the best reference work on birch, which you can get from Q Publishing. A bit plug there. So yeah, he was so good at understanding the birch, and he'd studied them as they grew as well, which a lot of people don't. And he'd studied them in the wild when he'd been off collecting the seed. So all of this led us to be sort of recognised as having this sort of scientific expertise on birch. We've also done studies with Queen Mary University of London on the molecular side of birch, and I'm still carrying on the conservation and the plant hunting trips. Yeah,
well, I will find out more about that after this bit of music. But yes, back with Paul soon. This is Kelsey Back. Do you like your music, Paul?
Oh yeah, I love music. Yeah, always have done. Yeah, quite an eclectic, varied choice of music, really.
Yeah. Well, lots of gardeners do love music, because it's something you could. Well, obviously, just not having any sound at all when you're gardening is lovely. But sometimes when you've got work to do and you've got to get through it, having a bit like a shanty, I suppose, it keeps you going, doesn't it?
Yeah, I often sort of have a tune going inside my head. Usually a really annoying one that I can't get rid of.
Yeah, an earworm, isn't it? Well, this is BBC Radio Devon. I'm in studio with Paul Bartlett, who's the garden manager of Stone Lane Gardens, a gem of a place near Chagford. And birch trees are a plant that people will be familiar with, but probably they know the native birch, and then there's Jacquemontii.
Yeah. I mean, sadly, it's inevitable, I suppose, really. Birch, people think of birch as being white trees, don't they, the silver birch. And in reality, in a lot of parts of the world, birch are not white at all. In the mountains of China and all through Bhutan and Arunachal Pradesh, parts of India, then these trees are often much darker barked and almost like the Prunus cerula, the Tibetan cherry.
Sort of like a polished mahogany.
Sort of polished, sort of brownish, reddish colours. Really beautiful barks, and worth growing a lot more really than people have been. Very difficult to change people's perceptions of what they think of as a birch.
The lady of the forest, isn't it, people?
That's right.
You heard that one?
Yeah, I heard that one, which is, it's all about, I think it relates back to Norse mythology or something.
Oh, really?
Apparently. But you can imagine a tree that's been used by humans over the millennia is bound to have lots of folk and myths about it as well.
Yeah.
Because, birch trees have been used by people in the northern hemisphere, which is where birch come from. They don't come from the southern hemisphere. Tribal the nomadic tribes used to use birch a lot in Siberia, Scandinavia, North America.
Make
Canada.
a drop of wine from it, can't you?
You can make a drop of wine, yeah. So I've had some birch spirit over the years, and you can drink the sap as well, like people do in Siberia particularly. You can do all sorts of things with birch. Yeah, a very useful tree.
You're a very good firelighter. The outside, the peel that comes off.
Yeah, that's right.
Stems,
the bark has a lot of resin in it, which burns quite hot. Quite a lot of heat in that resin when it burns, and I'm always when I bring garden groups around the garden, I always like to light a bit of bark, not on the tree obviously, a little bit of loose bark, just to show them how flammable it is. And I had an Australian group in once who, when I did that, they all kind of leapt back, and they were sort of aghast that anyone would light something amongst a load of trees, because clearly if you did that in Australia, you'd probably start a forest fire.
Well, you'd be looking at a 20-year stretch, actually, wouldn't you? That's how it would go, Paul. But I completely get the lady of the forest and the love of the white white bark birches, because when you come across them in sort of often what's quite dark conifer woods, they just look magical. But you're saying that the mahogany coloured ones and the pinks, there's something in them as well.
Beautiful, yeah. I mean, especially there's the thing called the red Chinese birch, Betula albosinensis, which you can
repeat
get
that,
in the
would
trade.
you, Paul?
Sorry, Betula albosinensis.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, but that's quite popular in the trade. It's a lovely varied tree in the mountains of China, and the bark colours vary throughout its lifetime, and as it peels, because the ultraviolet gets the outer bark eventually and makes different colours, makes it fade slightly, but as it peels, and it peels in quite large sheets as well, and underneath you get different colours coming through. So throughout the whole age and life of the tree, and depending on the weather conditions, the bark changes all the time, and if it's been raining, it looks much darker because you see the colours more. So it's those kind of Chinese red birch and things like that are very, very beautiful trees, as are the Himalayan birch, Betula utilis, which the Jack Montii is a subspecies of, but everyone knows that one, the white Himalayan birch, but the darker ones from further east in the Himalayas, they're beautiful as well. Really lovely trees.
I like the Jack Montii's wine glass shape. It looks like a big red wine glass in maturity. And there's a Swedish birch that's got cascading. I've got that right?
Yeah,
so
that's right. Yeah, you've got
foliage.
some of the Swedish birch are very weeping varieties of silver Betula pendula, the normal sort of silver birch of northern Europe. Yeah.
But which would you recommend? I mean, you've obviously been around birch long enough to really see the runners and riders, because how many have you got at Stone Lane?
We've got 49 different taxa at Stone Lane, the various subspecies and varieties, and from about 188, 190 provenances around the world, around the Northern Hemisphere. So most of them are wild collected, and this is the important thing about those collections, is they're wild collected, so we know where they came from, we know what they are, rather than them coming from a nursery, which collections built up from nursery stock are very difficult to prove their provenance often. It all gets a bit muddled in the trade. So the importance of those collections at Stone Lane Gardens are that we know where they've come from.
Yes, it's not that the nurseries do anything wrong, but just for listeners who might be new to gardening, if you've got a birch tree that does well in a pot, that's the one that will be sold nationally, but it might not be particularly good in the ground. That's how it goes, isn't it?
Yeah, people rely on the media for their choices, so it's what people know about and read about and see that they go by.
Yeah. But Paul, what was your favourite birch? I never got it out of you.
Yeah, sorry, I was rambling there. My favourite birch, I haven't really got a favourite, but I mean, Betula omanii, the Japanese birch, is a beautiful tree because it's got the lovely bark, which is quite pale creamy orange, has these stripy lenticels going round the bark. These are the lenticels being the bits that extract the gases from the tree and pull in gases to the tree. But they look beautiful swirling around the bark, and then you've got the great autumn colour as well, because unfortunately a lot of the good coloured bark trees don't have brilliant autumn colour.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's right. It's not like our silver birch, which has that lovely autumn colour, but the Japanese birch, the omanii, has beautiful autumn colour as well. So it's got everything, really. So that's a lovely tree.
Betula omanii, how tall does it get?
It can get quite tall. It's a bit broader as well than some of the built birch, which you always think of as being quite a delicate tree, and they are on the whole. Betula omanii gets probably about 50, 60 foot tall, bit broader than the others. It's got slightly longer side branches, so it does eventually become a more statuesque tree.
It's a proper tree. But and just one other thing about birches, there was a sort of fashion for planting them in groups or threes, or getting them to be multi-stem by trimming them down. What would you recommend you do to get more, kind of more of the same plant, but not such a tall one?
Well, multi-stem. You can get multi-stem trees, although birch don't always grow as a multi-stem. So trying to achieve that artificially can be a bit tricky. Sometimes it's easier simply to plant 3 or 5 trees really close together.
How close?
Or as close as you like. Birch can tolerate close by. You can put them all in the same planting hole.
Really?
You've just got to bear in mind that when they're mature, where their boughs are going to be, where their stems are going to be. If you put them within a few inches of each other, then clearly they're going to sort of fuse together, and maybe that may be detrimental really in the long term. But
they wouldn't push each other over.
Well, they wouldn't, but they could just become that joint where they fuse together is a potential weakness in the tree then, and disease or pests can get in there. So it's best probably to plant them a bit further apart than that, but not very far, a foot or two apart. And then you'll get, when they're mature, you'll have that lovely multi-stem look, which people do love. But then equally, if you come to the garden, you see them in copses of 9, 15 trees, and where they're not so close together, but as a mass effect, all those stems close together, particularly if they're pruned up, so that you can see through the stems, then that's a beautiful effect as well.
And is part of your work cleaning the bark? I mean, do you get
do have to clean the bark? Yeah. We're about to invest in a proper pressure washer thing to clean it, because I've been for years scrubbing them with a brush and a hose, and it's a very time-consuming, wet and exhausting job. But it's worth doing, because you get a lot of, especially in the West Country, nice, clean but moist air, and you get a lot of algae and lichen growing on the bark, and you know. People want to see the bark, so you've got to clean it occasionally.
Yeah, bring out the best in it. Paul Bartlett from Stone Lane Gardens. I've got some quick fire questions for you.
Sure.
Okay, alder or birch?
Yeah.
Either or. Which is your desert island tree?
Oh, birch, definitely.
Well, you can make the wine out of that. So
yeah. Well, you could build a canoe out of it and sail away from the desert island.
Well, this is it. Sculpture or statuary?
Sculpture.
Oh, really? Is it? What is it about? Do you really feel the art when you see some pieces when they're arranged in the gardens?
I think some work incredibly well in a garden environment, and some artists are incredibly clever as well at putting them in the right place in the garden.
Oh, do they have free reign to do that?
Well, to an extent, yeah. We have to rein them in a bit, because I've got to be able to get the mower around. But and there's no point in putting them in the garden somewhere where the undergrowth is just going to make them disappear in a few months.
Yeah.
But no, some of them are incredibly good at placing their work.
Okay. Autumn or summer?
Autumn.
Trees again?
Yeah. Well, summer. I think summer is well, in the UK. Come on, summer's a bit of a disappointing time, isn't it? Autumn's got a lovely feel about it. Although it's slightly going to sleep, it's also you've got the colour, haven't you? And you've got and to be honest, the weather's all better in the autumn.
Well, that's a very interesting philosophy. You're accepting that summer will be dreadful, and but autumn, you know it'll be mixed, and you can live with that because you got no hope. But that's well, fair enough, Paul.
I've got to be a realist when you're a gardener.
Yeah, funny enough, Wednesday was so awful. It was so awful, wasn't it? And I didn't realise how depressed it made me until the sun came out yesterday. And I was doing a bit of gardening. I didn't realise how lifting the blue sky was. I was hanging on.
Yeah,
I was hanging on.
Good philosophy.
Yeah, woodland or wilderness?
Well, they can be both, can't they? I love wilderness areas, particularly when we're doing our conservation work, like we're doing in Georgia. Then wilderness areas are beautiful because they're so untouched.
Georgia, as in sort of Black Sea.
Yes, Georgia, below Russia.
Tell me a bit about that. This conservation work.
Well, I started studying several of the birch in Georgia that we don't know a great deal about, and it's a wonderful country in terms of diversity of flora and fauna. It sits on that kind of crossroads between northern Europe and Asia and sort of the east and the west, and so it's got a massive diversity of plant life, and also it never really got hit by the ice ages so much as the northern Europe did. So as you can imagine, there's a greater diversity, greater biodiversity. And anyway, I went over there to look at some of the trees back in 2012 and discovered that there was this one birch, Bechnum agretica, which is not a lot was known about, and we had trouble finding it in the wild. And subsequent trips back out there, I managed to find populations of them and start to learn a bit more about them. We didn't know much about them really before, only from material that would come from Moscow Botanic Garden. Very little written evidence about where they grew, how they grew. So I wanted to study that more, and then we discovered in the process that they were actually under quite a threat from human activities. They only grow in really tiny areas in Georgia, in the mountains, in the Caucasus Mountains. So we got involved with BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, in this conservation project to try and raise awareness in Georgia of how endangered they are. It's a bit difficult because you're dealing with a country which is quite poor economically.
It's got its troubles, isn't it? Yeah.
So it's difficult in any of those kind of countries, as all conservationists will know, to really get people to take seriously something they're about to lose, because of their immediate priority is more about food and making a living. But we're
getting traction with that now. Do you think we're starting to work?
I think it's starting to work, and we've got we're educating now the local schools in Georgia in the area where this plant exists, and we've got Georgian botanists involved. I think it's starting to have a bit more of a positive effect.
Important work. Which brings me to my next question: Georgia or Germans Week?
Georgia.
Apologies to anyone listening in German. Tree or shrub?
Tree.
Yeah, that's. I guess that's going to be the case with you and your work at Stone Lane.
Yeah.
I mean, has it changed you as a person going to work in this garden? Because obviously you're doing different gardening jobs before, and it's probably a more diverse sort of interaction in a sense, because the garden that you've got is very special and it's quite specialist.
It is, yeah, and I admire those people I know plenty of garden plantsmen who have a massive knowledge of a broad range of plants, and I don't. I specialise in trees and birch and alder particularly, and I admire those people who've got that great knowledge. But for me, I love the trees more than anything else. Really, other plants I like as well. And when I go out collecting, I collect other plants as well. It's always great to be able to grow things anyway, any whatever shape or form. But trees, they're such amazing things, and they're so important. And they hold the environment together. They're the sort of the big structures that hold everything else together. And without the trees, everything else would fall apart, as we see when we look at these massive wheat plains and things where the biodiversity is so limited in them, and the erosion, and they cause all sorts of problems. Whereas trees were designed to they've evolved to fill a niche and create that big structure that everything else depends on. And you look, some of them are just huge as well. The redwoods in California, coastal redwoods. They're the equivalent of a 38-story building, and you can't. It's difficult to even imagine that is a living thing. It's just so huge, and if you go there and you're underneath them, you feel so insignificant. These things have been growing for 2,000 years, and they're still growing. I think
that's the thing about humanity, full stop, isn't it? Really, we're so small. We don't see the trees because they're bigger than us, and we don't notice them. We see the trunks, but all that's going on in the canopy, all the life, and there's a sort of, there's a tree, the insurance are worried that it might fall down. I mean,
but I'd encourage people, go climb a tree. Being up in a tree, great. I mean,
when was the last time you climbed a tree?
Well, actually, I climbed a tree quite recently, because I do it as part of my job anyway, for tree surgery. But also, I've got this hammock now. A friend of mine who works or runs the Arboretum at Oxford Botanic Garden, he's a big tree climber, and he loves to sleep in the trees. So he got me interested in sleeping in the trees, which I did one the other day at Stone Lane. Up one at some of the alders, went up there with the ropes and slung a hammock in about 40 foot off the ground, and slept in a hammock while my partner Rachel slept sensibly on the ground below.
And did you sleep?
Yeah, it was great. It was lovely and really comfortable, just sort of swaying amongst the leaves and that up in the crown. It was fantastic.
Good gracious. Where did you keep your water? I mean, did you have that on a branch, just a handy little shelf?
You can always come down. It does come with a beer pouch, but I haven't tried that. That could be. I'm not sure that's a good mix, tree climbing and beer, but I don't know, maybe.
And what's next for Stone Lane Gardens?
Well, we've got we've still got this sculpture exhibition running. That runs until the end of October, and the garden itself is open all year round, all through the winter as well. And then the nursery kicks off, so people can buy trees in the winter from the nursery at Stone Lane Gardens, because we sell them all bare root through the winter. And some of the sort of unusual birch that you can't get anywhere else, we supply. And
so you head to Chagford, and you're easy to find.
Easy to find, yeah. And in fact, Miranda Rowhewson you had on earlier, down at Morton Hampstead, her garden's open. It's only a couple of miles down the road, so you can come up to Stone Lane.
Well, there we are. Check that out. Now, tell me about the record you've chosen.
Uptown Funk. Yeah, well, it's just a great bit of dance music, isn't it? I mean, it's a lovely, quite complicated track, really. I'd hate to have to try and play it, but it's a great bit of music. And if I want to do a bit of dad dancing and make Rachel cringe, then that's the track I'll do it to.
There's nothing wrong with a bit of dad dancing, Paul. Thank you, you've been a wonderful guest.
Thanks very much.